1% of the population owns half of England. It's a rather arresting statistic on the fly cover of Guy Shrubsole's new book. Guy, you will know, as an environmental campaigner and author, and the new book is called The Lie of the Land. It follows on from a previous book called Who Owns England, and in a sense the new book is about what they've done with what they own. Let's begin with why this is immediately problematic, Guy. There's also a Matthew Paris quote, isn't there, at the front of the book about so that the land needs to be owned if it's looked after. So is it necessarily and inevitably a bad thing to have such a huge amount of land concentrated in such a tiny proportion of the population?
Well, good to speak to you, James, and thanks for that introduction. So yes, I mean, my book is about land ownership and how it's used. And you're right, I start with a quote from Matthew Paris saying that land has to be owned in order to be looked after. My contention is that this is one of the lies that is told about our land, which is a sort of a kind of way of deflecting away from the concentration of ownership of land in this country. It's basically this narrative that has grown up and has been told to us by groups like the Country Land and Business Association, groups like the National Farmers Union, who we obviously saw protesting yesterday, that farmers and landowners are inevitably the trusted custodians of the countryside. But this is a phrase that was deliberately used and put about as a PR term from the 1970s onwards by successive NFU presidents. Researching the book, this is what I found, that pretty much every NFU president since the 1970s has used this same phrase: "We are the custodians of the countryside," and it was in order to deflect attention away from the concerns, very legitimate concerns of environmentalists and the general public of the impacts of industrialized agriculture, intensive shooting, modern forestry on our wildlife and our habitats. We've lost half of all farmland birds since 1970. That's what the custodians of the countryside have done to nature in this country.
It's an incredible contradiction of what isn't just a party line for the NFU, but it's probably seeped into public consciousness really effectively, hasn't it? It's almost unchallenged.
Massively so. And you see that in much of the media coverage of the recent protests, of the whole debacle about agricultural property relief, and portrayals of farming more generally. I think the media has portrayed a very distorted view of the countryside, how land is used and who owns it.
Well, if you see it as another embodiment of epic and often inherited wealth, then I suppose a quick glance at who owns the newspapers will give you an explanation of who and indeed why they're portraying this particular conflict in the ways that they are. And it's profoundly relevant. I mean, you didn't know when you sat down to write this book that the government was planning to remove inheritance tax on farms, but I mean, it couldn't be more relevant to a lot of the stuff that you're writing about of the betrayal, really, of that history or claim of custodianship. Who are the offenders here? Because I don't want every farmer to think everyone who owns you need to own more land than the average bear to be a farmer, don't you? So what are the most egregious examples of what you're describing?
Look, let's start with that statistic she quoted earlier, that less than 1% of the population own half of all England. So let's dig into this a little bit more. So if you look at the official government figures, this is the DEFRA, Department for Environment figures, the June Agricultural Survey, which is brought out every year, and it's filled in by farmers and landowners themselves. You find that there's about 100,000 farms in England, and almost 60% of those farms are below 123 acres in size, 60% of them. So that gives you a sense of, wow. That's really where this sort of average farm is. At the other end of the scale, again, looking at these official stats, you can see that half the land in England is controlled by just 25,000 estates and agribusinesses. And then you start looking at the scale of some of those land holdings. You've got your Jeremy Clarksons who own 1,000 acres. That's bigger than 90% of all English farms, right? You've got the head of the Country Land and Business Association who was marching alongside Jeremy Clarkson yesterday, Lady Victoria Vivian. She owns a 1,000-acre estate in Cornwall. Then you get the really big guys. You've got the dukes, for example. We have dukes in this country still.
It's an extraordinary list, isn't it, when you see that, the dukes and the earls, 20 of them I've seen assembled in one place. And these are people who can possibly trace their ownership of this land back to William the Conqueror in some cases.
Absolutely. The Duke of Westminster, for example, his family, the Grosvenors, it comes from the kind of the nickname that Hugh Grosvenor was given, who was one of the Norman barons who came over in 1066 and conquered England. And Grosvenor, it means the fat hunter. So that was what the peasants were calling their lords and masters in those days. But didn't stop him from going on to acquire a huge amount of land gifted to him by William the Conqueror after the conquest. And the Grosvenor family continue to own hundreds of thousands of acres in this country to this very day. And you've got 20 dukes who own 1 million acres of Britain. 1 million acres.
And they presumably are going to be the most aggrieved about the new policy, potentially, albeit that a lot of it will be tied up in trust and things, won't it?
I noticed that the Duchess of Rutland, I think, wrote in the Telegraph.
I thought that was a pub.
Well, this is it. This is how the aristocracy, their influence bleeds into all our culture still. It's Downton Abbey, it's the worship of stately homes, the cult of the stately home still. But no, that genuinely, real person, the Duchess of Rutland wrote in the Telegraph how upset she was about the tax changes and how she was going to have to pay more inheritance tax. But look, the aristocracy are past masters at avoiding tax. We invented trust law in this country. Some of the aristocracy were some of the first pioneers of using offshore structures, offshore companies and trusts in the 1970s to try and avoid what were then more progressive rates of taxation than we have today. So this is a long history of the very the landed wealthy trying to avoid paying their fair share of tax.
And speaking of the Country Land and Business Association, its members own 1/3 of all the land in England and Wales.
That's right. And they have maybe 25,000 members. So, again, you get this sense of how concentrated and unequal land ownership is.
And I mean, it's two prongs to this, isn't there? There's the natural injustice, the sense of injustice, the reality of injustice, but also, and the central thrust of the book, what they are doing with the land that they own. And I mean, where's the line between technological advancement and long-term damage, as it were, or long-term danger?
Well, look, of course, a huge amount of the damage that's been done to the countryside has come from the intensification of agriculture in the decade since the Second World War. But some of it goes back a bit further, and you look at some of the noble country traditions that we have in this country, traditions that are, of course, actually only date from the Victorian period. Things like grouse shooting. I mean, not many people will be aware that an area the size of Greater London is devoted to shooting grouse in England. And this is what
Say that again.
An area the size of Greater London, this is over 500,000 acres of land, is devoted to shooting red grouse in England. And there's even more of it in the Scottish Highlands, millions more acres devoted to it in the Scottish Highlands. And this is land that is owned by a few hundred estates, 150 estates in England who own this vast area of land. And they burn it. And this is one of our biggest carbon stores. Peat bogs, huge stores of carbon, really, really important in the fight against climate change, really important habitats in their own right. But they are literally set fire to each year by their owners in order to maximize the numbers of game birds that they can shoot. So you sort of think these guys have the temerity to say that they're the custodians of the countryside.
And the book is full of examples of conduct that is the polar opposite of being a custodian of the countryside. I want to make it clear, though, that you speak from a place of love. You love the countryside, and many farmers are forces for good. It's just that this week, more than any other week, the blurring of those distinctions has been it's been incredible, frankly. So, what is a good farmer? What is a farmer who we need and value and cherish, and possibly who maybe does deserve a little bit of protection from politicians sometimes?
No, absolutely. Look, I live in Devon. My grandparents were lifelong farmers. My mum grew up on the family farm, which was 100 acres, incidentally. There are amazing examples of nature-friendly farmers, the nature-friendly farming network that exists that tries to represent farmers who are doing regenerative farming, who are restoring wildlife on their farms. Farmers like James Rebanks,
yes,
who has transformed, his farm in the Lake District, reduced the number of sheep increased the number of grazing cattle, done loads to restore wildlife.
And explained it all in beautiful poetic detail as well,
Exactly.
which is important.
Exactly. And he sort of often has also said we should call out, this whole argument about the custodians of the countryside. If we're not living up to it, then, we should call it out. And, there are also great examples of, some wealthy landowners who've done the same. There are some big landowners like, the Knepp estate in Sussex, where, sort of the poster child for rewilding in this country. The thing is that the thing is, right, is that I just don't think these kind of heroes can do it all by themselves.
No.
You can't just put all of the burden of restoring, these basically de-wilded isles of ours on the shoulders of just a few pioneers.
Has to be policy driven.
It has to be policy driven, and of course, we have to have proper rewards. We have to have a decent system of farm payments in place. That has been reformed since we left. Since Brexit, there is a new system of environmental land management payments in place. I think the budget for that actually should be bigger, considerably larger. But I also think it should be something where we are holding all landowners, particularly large landowners, more accountable for how they're spending that money and what they're doing with their land.
Go on.
Sorry.
No,
I would require all landowners who own more than 1,000 acres, the Jeremy Clarksons and of this world and above, to have to report publicly on what they're doing to look after the land.
And I think yesterday we got rather embarrassed by Victoria Derbyshire interviewing him in the middle of the march, claimed that he'd only bought the farm so he could have a shoot, which tallies with quite a few of the things that you've talked about. I'd mention also James Rebanks was my guest on Full Disclosure a couple of weeks ago, and you can find out a lot more about him by listening to that. The Lie of the Land, there's a camera, I'm not being weird, there's a camera over there, so I'm holding up the book so you can see it. The Lie of the Land by Guy Shrubsole is out now. This is an unfair question sometimes to ask authors, so feel free to ignore it, but what are you setting out to do with this book?
Well, I want to help spark a conversation about land reform in England. I want us in England to look to what's happened in Scotland over the last 20 years. There's been a really, really vibrant debate about land in Scotland, about who owns it and what's it for and how do we look after it better. There's been amazing examples in Scotland of communities buying land and being given the powers to do so. There is some talk that the Labour government is going to bring forward legislation to allow that right to happen here as well. But fundamentally, this is about, I think, democracy, accountability, transparency. It's about all of us having more of a say over how land is used and, really holding to account more of the big landowners who we don't often hear about in the media.
You're right. Earl of Derby's
what they're doing with it.
The Earl of Derby's very unhappy about these new tax rules, isn't he? For example.
Well, let me fetch my tiny violin.
Guy Shrubsole, thank you. The Lie of the Land, as I say, is out now.